The number one thing you need to know about to understand history and genealogy are the ways that people traveled and migrated in the past. When we're looking at something like a family living in the same house for generations, it's easy to think that their lives were really static. And in general, we tend to assume that our ancestors had really small worlds. Then gradually, through globalization in the 20th century, their worlds became bigger and more interconnected. Well, none of that's really true, and in reality, the world has always been really interconnected in complex ways, and our ancestors moved around a lot. Welcome to GenealCymru. My name is Di, and today we are going to look at some of the forces that pushed and pulled our ancestors across the landscape. Here's a 1750 map of Welsh market towns and the roads that connected them. Market towns were really important throughout history. They were the places that people went to sell and buy their wares. It's where livestock was traded and purchased, and they were also relatively stable fixtures in the Welsh landscape, since they had to be officially recognized as a market town by a royal charter straight from the monarch. In the area of mid-Cardiganshire, where I do a lot of my research, the two main market towns were Lampeter and Tregaron. Tregaron, for example, received its royal charter in 1292 from Edward I. This granted it the right to a weekly market and a yearly fair. These weekly and yearly events brought people together in this collective way, which was important in a country that has historically been really sparsely populated. If we zoom in to look at the county of Cardiganshire, there are these boundaries that outline the areas that receive services from each market town. So think schooling, banking, and healthcare. So here's the Lampeter Union, and here's the Tregaron Union. One tricky thing to note is that sometimes these union boundaries disregarded county boundaries, so Lampeter Union actually crosses over into part of Carmarthenshire. My ancestors in this part of Wales come mainly from this area here. And generally, all of my ancestors to the south of the boundary were all very connected to Lampeter, and those to the north were more connected to Tregaron. They were going to these different towns to marry people, they were purchasing and renting properties there, they were involved in the local judicial system, they were attending agricultural events, and for all of my ancestors in this area, when I can't find them in their parish of origin, I find them in these towns. So if you can find out what local places your ancestors were drawn to, it really does open up a lot of opportunities to find them in the records there. And beyond just finding them in the records, you can start to find the people that they associated with, their friends, future spouses, and business partners. And it also gives you a place to start doing some historical research so that you can find out what life was like in that region. Because the places that were focal points for social life in the past are also the ones that are going to draw the attention of historians and other writers. And it doesn't have to be a market town. You can also think of nonconformist chapels in the same way because they served people not only in the same parish, but also sometimes as far as hundreds of kilometers away. There were also private schools, mines, and noble estate houses, all sorts of places that drew people towards them. When thinking about our ancestors' everyday lives, don't confuse geographic distances with social distances. What I mean by that is that just because some place looks close doesn't mean it's always important socially, and in turn, geographically distant places aren't always unimportant. I think that that's one of the big ways that maps can misguide us. So let's look at an example. This is Daniel Jenkins. He was a descendant of my 8 times great-grandparents, and he wrote an article in the newspaper in 1945 about social practices of landowning farmers in mid-Cardiganshire. He wrote that there was a custom among these farmers of sending some of their younger boys and girls to Herefordshire to learn English. If we look at the map, these two places are really geographically distant, but they were connected by this social practice. The earliest evidence that I have of this practice in my own family is when my 7 times great-grandmother's brother, David Davis of Castell went to Leominster to study under his uncle in the 1760s. This relationship between Mid-Cardiganshire and Herefordshire continued for over 100 years after that, until it was disrupted in 1870 by the Elementary Education Act and the establishment of local educational authorities in Wales. But even Daniel Jenkins, at the time of the 1871 census, was actually living in Herefordshire for school. There are these kinds of traditions all across Wales, connecting geographically distant places, and you can discover a lot of them by simply learning the history of those places, and by doing that, you'll have an easier time of finding your ancestors once they leave the place where they grew up. And you'll be able to start to answer the why of it all. Why did they leave, and why did they settle where they did? Sometimes the why was about opportunity. Probably the most important example of this is the great exodus from rural Wales to the industrial towns in the late 1800s and early 1900s. By that time, economic opportunities, especially for the laboring class, were really stagnating or declining in rural Wales. And it was a number of factors contributing to this. The Great Agricultural Depression, the mechanization of farming, changes in land tenancy, and the new railways. These all contributed to a feeling of insecurity. Agricultural laborers generally worked longer hours, lived in worse conditions, and were paid much less than urban laborers. In fact, according to Dr. Catherine Cooper, industrial wage rates were generally almost 50% higher than agricultural rates in the 1870s. So for many people, life in industrial towns and villages became synonymous with opportunity. But whether this promise of opportunity resulted in a material improvement in our ancestors' lives is another matter. But this is a kind of migration that happened all across Wales and had undeniable impacts on both the people who migrated and those they left behind. The really interesting thing about migration and travel of any sort is that as people enter new social situations in these new places, they have the opportunity to live their life differently. One of my favorite examples from my own family is from my 4 times great-grandmother, Esther Thomas. In the 1880s, she left the village of Llandybia to live with her daughter's family in Llangyfelech, outside Swansea. All of a sudden, she starts identifying as a widow, despite never having been married. In this new place, she was able to live a different life, away from some of the stigma of being an unmarried mother, because no one knew her there. In other cases, people transformed their lives by challenging the gendered norms of the day. Ancestral trans people like Harry Stokes, John Murphy, Fred Mitchell, Josiah Charles Stevenson, all from mid-19th century in England, all had migration in common. They all left their places of birth, and in their new homes, where no one knew them, they were able to live their lives as men. A couple of them even married women and built their own families in these new places. Even the famous ladies of Llangollen were originally from Ireland, but moved to Wales and lived their lives together away from many of the expectations that their families and home communities would have had for them. And no matter who you're looking at, migration and travel are fascinating transformational moments. So let me know down in the comments about any of your own ancestors' experiences of migration and travel. Where did they go and why? And how did it change their lives? And since you've made it this far, why not also check out this next video about the importance of animals in our ancestors' lives?